The night was crisp, the sky a canvas of deep blue, punctuated by the bright glow of scattered stars. It was Halloween night, and for the Thompson family, it should have been a night of celebration, laughter, and tradition. The small suburban neighborhood was decked out in all the trimmings of the season, pumpkins grinning from every doorstep, webs adorning the hedges, and the faint sound of children's laughter echoing through the streets as they made their way from house to house. Inside the Thompson home, the warmth of the fireplace flickered softly, casting long shadows across the room. Sarah Thompson, a loving mother in her mid-30s, smiled as she looked over at her husband, Mike, who was setting up the final decorations in the living room. Their daughter, Lily, a sweet and quiet 11-year-old, sat by the window, peering out at the darkened streets, a look of anticipation on her face. Lily was in a wheelchair, her small hands gripping the armrests as she gazed outside, excited for the night ahead. "It's going to be a great Halloween," Sarah said, her voice light and hopeful. "We'll make sure Lily has a night to remember." Mike chuckled, his face creasing into a smile as he adjusted a strand of fake spider web. "You bet. I'll make sure no one forgets our house, best haunted house on the block." Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement, her gaze drifting between her parents as they spoke. But there was something else in her expression, a subtle tension that seemed to rise in the stillness of the room. She had always loved Halloween, the costumes, the candy, the chance to escape into a world of imagination. Yet, tonight, she felt a faint unease. The neighborhood was buzzing, but there was a dark undercurrent that seemed to hover just out of sight. It wasn't the decorations. It wasn't the eerie moonlight casting long, strange shadows across the yard. It was the quiet, subtle tension between her family and the homeowners association. Karen, the president of the HOA, had always been a presence in their lives, her watchful eyes constantly monitoring the neighborhood, ready to call out any perceived violation, no matter how small. The Thompsons had clashed with her in the past, but this year, Halloween of all nights, seemed to be different. Karen's glare had lingered longer than usual during their last brief encounter at the mailbox, and the icy tone in her voice had sent a ripple of unease through Sarah's heart. Sarah glanced at the clock, 7:30 p.m. The trick-or-treaters were out in full force now, their laughter filling the streets as they dashed from house to house. The Thompsons were ready to enjoy their night, but somewhere in the back of their minds, the unease grew. Halloween should have been about fun, about magic. Instead, it was starting to feel like a battle was brewing, a storm ready to break. "Mom," Lily's soft voice cut through the quiet. She didn't look up from the window, her eyes still fixed on the street outside. "Do you think Karen will come tonight?" Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't spoken Karen's name aloud in weeks, but hearing it from Lily's lips made the tension even more palpable. "I don't know, sweetie," Sarah replied gently, walking over to her daughter's side and resting a hand on her shoulder. "But if she does, we'll just be polite and keep having fun. This night is about you, remember? It's your special night." Lily nodded, her fingers twitching nervously as she turned her attention back to the window. But even as Sarah tried to reassure her, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight, something would happen that would change everything. Outside, the street was alive with the spirit of Halloween, but the Thompsons' house sat at the edge of the neighborhood, a little too close to the edge of Karen's watchful eye. The storm wasn't loud, wasn't obvious. But it was coming. And no one, not even Sarah, could quite tell what would trigger it. The night seemed perfect, and yet, beneath the surface, there was a sense of impending danger. The storm was coming, quietly. But in the world of the Thompsons, it would shatter everything they thought they knew about their peaceful life. And as the final trick-or-treaters passed by, laughing and carefree, the first signs of the storm were already forming. Karen Whitmore had always been the type of woman who craved control. It was the driving force behind her every action, from her immaculate lawn to her unwavering belief that the rules of the neighborhood, rules she helped enforce as the president of the HOA, were sacred. To her, the subdivisions and manicured lawns were more than just a place to live, they were a reflection of her power, her sense of order, and her refusal to allow anyone to disrupt that peace. Growing up, Karen never experienced much stability. Her parents had been well-meaning but uninvolved, more concerned with their own lives than with their daughter's needs. She learned early that if she wanted something, be it affection, recognition, or control, she had to take it. The world never offered her anything for free. As a result, she became fiercely independent, determined to make her mark on the world around her. And when she moved into the upscale suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook Ridge, she saw an opportunity to create the perfect environment, one where everything was orderly, pristine, and under her command. It didn't take long for Karen to rise to the top. She charmed her neighbors with her impeccably clean home, her keen eye for detail, and her obsession with rules. She volunteered for the HOA, her political ambitions slowly surfacing under the guise of community service. Soon enough, she became the president, and the title suited her perfectly. The power to dictate what was and wasn't acceptable in Willowbrook Ridge was intoxicating, and Karen relished it. But what really fueled Karen's obsession wasn't just her love for rules, it was her need to control others. She became the neighborhood's self-appointed gatekeeper, scrutinizing every corner of every yard, from the color of the mailbox to the placement of each flower pot. There was a satisfying certainty in knowing that her neighbors, from the young families to the retirees, would always look to her for approval. She knew she had them in the palm of her hand. One family in particular, however, seemed to get under her skin more than the others, the Thompsons. It was the way they defied her without even trying, the way they lived their lives with a quiet rebellion that irritated her beyond measure. It wasn't that they were rude or disrespectful, no. Sarah Thompson was polite and well-mannered, and Mike was a good husband. But it was their careless disregard for Karen's authority that stung. Take their Halloween decorations, for example. Each year, the Thompsons would go all out, creating a whimsical yet eerie display of pumpkins, ghosts, and skeletons. The whole yard would transform into a scene from a haunted house, complete with fog machines and cobwebs stretching across the trees. It was charming in its own way, but Karen found it too much. It was always a little too loud, a little too extravagant for her tastes. "Think of the children," she would mutter, shaking her head when Sarah mentioned their plans for Halloween. "We don't want to give them nightmares, do we? There's a balance to be struck, you know. The neighborhood has standards to uphold." Every year, she would visit Sarah under the guise of neighborly concern, offering unsolicited advice about how to tone down the decorations. And every year, Sarah would smile and thank her, assuring her that they were just having fun. But Karen wasn't fooled. She saw the Thompsons as a threat, an example of what could happen when people didn't know their place. The real issue, though, wasn't the decorations, it was Halloween night itself. For Karen, Halloween represented chaos, a break from the structure and order that she worked so hard to maintain. The unregulated madness of children running wild through the streets, the sudden surge of strangers knocking on doors, it all sent shivers down her spine. She would rather see it all disappear, swept under a rug of suburban conformity. But no matter how many times she reminded Sarah about keeping things tasteful, the Thompsons always found ways to push the boundaries, always stretching the limits of what was acceptable. Halloween was their one night to truly rebel against the oppressive norms of the neighborhood, and Karen could not stand it. This year, Karen had made up her mind, she would not let them get away with it. The decorations were already excessive, but now, this year, it was personal. She had seen Sarah in the yard earlier that week, adjusting the lights around the pumpkins with a smile. The audacity of it. The Thompsons were getting too comfortable. Something had to be done, and Karen was ready to take matters into her own hands. As she sat by her front window that Halloween night, watching the Thompsons' house from across the street, Karen felt a gnawing anger rise inside her. The bright orange lights glowing from the Thompsons' front yard cast a strange, almost ominous glow on the sidewalk. The ghosts in the trees swayed gently in the breeze, but to Karen, they looked like whispers of rebellion, taunting her from across the way. She had already made the call to the authorities, of course. The Thompsons were violating neighborhood code again. The decorations were too loud, too unsettling. It wasn't about the rules anymore, it was about making a statement. She had to remind them who was in charge. But it wasn't just about Halloween. This was bigger than that. For Karen, this was about control. This was about her power over the neighborhood, her ability to keep everyone in line. She could already feel the storm brewing, a storm that would soon be unleashed. The Thompsons had no idea what was coming their way. As she watched the Thompsons' house from her front window, Karen's lips curled into a smile. The storm was about to hit, and it would be more than just a Halloween prank. It would be the beginning of a new order, one where Karen would finally make them pay for their defiance. Tonight, she would show them who was really in charge. The night air had cooled, and the neighborhood was alive with energy, children running from house to house, their laughter rising above the sound of rustling leaves. The faint aroma of caramel apples and pumpkin spice lingered in the cool breeze, but in the Thompson household, there was no joy. As Sarah adjusted the final piece of their Halloween decorations, the unsettling feeling from earlier in the evening grew stronger. Sarah tried to focus on the fun. It was meant to be Lily's night, the one night where she could forget the limitations imposed on her by her disability. A wheelchair-bound girl shouldn't have to worry about rules, after all. But tonight, Lily's excitement seemed to waver, her usual enthusiasm clouded by the tension that had lingered between her family and the HOA president, Karen Whitmore. "We should take Lily out for a walk," Mike suggested, looking out the window at the growing number of trick-or-treaters gathering on the street. "Let her enjoy the night, maybe see some of the decorations up close." Sarah agreed with a smile, but her mind was elsewhere. She had felt Karen's eyes on them earlier, those piercing, judgmental glares as Sarah adjusted the Halloween lights. The HOA president had been quiet for weeks, but Sarah knew better than to think that would last. She knew that tonight would be no different. Karen had made her displeasure clear before. And Sarah couldn't help but feel that the air was charged with a sense of impending conflict. The doorbell rang, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. "Trick or treat," came the cheerful chorus of a group of neighborhood kids. Sarah handed out candy, trying to mask the growing sense of unease in her chest. Mike grabbed Lily's wheelchair, gently lifting her out of the living room as they made their way toward the door. As they stepped outside, the cool night air seemed to amplify the tension. Their house, covered in cobwebs, pumpkins, and eerie lights, was the focal point of attention. The neighbors had mostly kept to their own, but the couple's bold display of Halloween spirit was hard to ignore. There was a certain defiance in it, and Sarah felt a pang of guilt for enjoying the moment. Lily's wheelchair rolled smoothly over the paved sidewalk as Mike pushed her toward the end of the driveway. They passed other families, exchanging smiles and greetings. But there was one face that stood out, a face that froze Sarah in her tracks. Karen Whitmore was standing across the street, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes narrowed and fixed directly on them. She wasn't in costume, but her presence alone was enough to cast a shadow over the evening. The crisp Halloween air seemed to shift, and the sounds of the neighborhood faded, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "Mom," Lily whispered softly, "is she looking at us?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She didn't have to. Lily knew. Karen was always watching. And the sight of her across the street, so still and rigid, made Sarah's stomach twist. "Let's keep walking," Sarah said, her voice calm but forced. "We'll just ignore her for now." But the unease in Sarah's chest only deepened as they continued down the sidewalk. Karen's eyes followed them with unsettling intensity, and as Sarah turned to look at her daughter, she noticed something strange, a glimmer of something in Karen's hand. She couldn't quite make it out, but it was small, metallic. A tool, maybe. A weapon? "Mom, can we go back?" Lily asked, her voice trembling now. Sarah nodded, her heart racing. There was something wrong in the air. Something about Karen's gaze, her posture, something felt off. They turned around, heading back toward their house, but before Sarah could make sense of what was happening, she heard a voice call out. "Sarah!" It was Karen's voice, cutting through the night air, sharp and cold. "You're causing a disturbance with all this nonsense. This is not what Halloween is supposed to be about." The words were harsh, biting. Sarah felt her heart skip. She stopped in her tracks, glancing over at Mike, who was pushing Lily's wheelchair forward. "I'm just trying to make sure Lily has a good time, Karen," Sarah called back, her voice steady despite the anxiety that bubbled beneath the surface. "What's the harm in that?" Karen took a step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she approached them. Her face was rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was fuming now. "This," she motioned broadly to the decorations, "this is an embarrassment. It's out of control. The whole neighborhood can see this. You're setting a bad example for the children. And I won't stand for it." Sarah's mind raced, heart pounding in her chest. She had heard this speech before. Karen's disgust for their excessive Halloween celebrations had been a recurring theme. But tonight, it felt different, more menacing, like something was about to snap. "We're not hurting anyone," Sarah said, keeping her voice as calm as possible. "It's just a little fun. Why can't you let people enjoy themselves?" Karen took another step closer, her body language now completely closed off. "Because this isn't fun," she hissed. "It's chaos. And chaos has no place in Willowbrook Ridge. I won't allow it." The tension in the air became suffocating. Sarah could feel it, the hostility radiating off Karen, growing sharper, more dangerous. And just as she was about to respond, something unexpected happened. Karen moved suddenly, quicker than Sarah could process. The object in her hand, a small metallic gun, glinted under the porch light. A split second of shock was all it took. The sharp crack of the shot echoed in the night, a deafening sound that shattered the fragile calm. Lily let out a gasp, her body jerking in the wheelchair. In that horrifying moment, Sarah felt the world slow down. She turned to Lily just in time to see her daughter's body convulse in pain, blood splattering across her Halloween costume. A crimson stain began to spread on Lily's leg, and her terrified eyes locked onto Sarah's. "No!" Sarah screamed, rushing to her daughter's side, her hands trembling as she desperately tried to staunch the bleeding. "Lily, sweetheart, stay with me. Mike, help." Mike's voice was frantic as he dropped to his knees beside Sarah, attempting to stop the blood flow with his hands, but it was no use. The damage had been done. Lily's life was slipping away, and the world around them descended into a chaotic blur of panic and confusion. Karen stood frozen in place, her face expressionless as she held the gun in her hand, the reality of her actions still sinking in. The night that was supposed to be full of joy, laughter, and trick-or-treating had transformed into a nightmare. The air, once filled with the sounds of children's laughter, was now pierced by the horrifying silence of shock. Every second felt like an eternity. The calm had shattered. And with it, so had the Thompsons' world. The shrill wail of an ambulance siren pierced the night, but it felt distant, almost as if it were happening in another world, one that had no place for the tragedy unfolding at the Thompsons' doorstep. The warm Halloween glow that once bathed their house in orange light now seemed grotesque, the flickering of the porch lights casting long, eerie shadows. Sarah's hands were trembling as she clutched Lily's limp form in her arms, the blood still soaking through her fingers, spreading across her daughter's costume like a dark, creeping stain. Mike's voice was strained as he screamed into the phone, giving the operator directions. His eyes were wide, frantic, filled with terror. "We need help. Please. My daughter's been shot. She's bleeding." But Sarah couldn't hear him. She couldn't hear anything over the deafening roar of her own heartbeat, the cold emptiness that had settled in her chest. The pain in Lily's leg was too much to process, but the worst part was the coldness that was slowly taking over her daughter's once bright, hopeful eyes. Lily, the girl who had so much life left to live, was slipping away. And then, through the panic, Sarah heard the click of a door shutting, followed by the sound of someone's footsteps. Her head snapped up. It was Karen. Karen Whitmore, the woman responsible for this nightmare, was standing across the street, her expression disturbingly calm. Her lips were pursed into a thin line, and her eyes, cold, unfeeling, watched them from a distance, as if observing a scene that was more fascinating than tragic. Sarah's blood ran cold, her entire body stiffening as she processed the horror of the moment. Karen had shot her daughter. But the worst part was that she wasn't running away. She wasn't hiding in shame. No, she was standing there, waiting. Sarah's stomach turned as the realization set in. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. Karen had planned this. It wasn't enough to punish them for the perceived affront to her sense of order, Karen had to take it further. She had to break them. And she had succeeded. Karen, Sarah whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. She didn't even recognize her own voice, so small, so weak. Karen tilted her head slightly, a flicker of something akin to satisfaction crossing her face. "It's done," she said coldly, as if they were discussing the most mundane of matters, rather than the life of an innocent child. "Your family never learned. You all needed a lesson." Mike turned to face her, his face twisted with a mix of horror and rage. "You," his voice broke, and he swallowed hard before continuing, "you've done enough. What kind of monster are you? You've shot our daughter. You've killed her." Karen's eyes didn't flinch. She didn't respond immediately, just stood there, silent and still, almost as if waiting for them to understand. It was then that Sarah noticed something that sent a chill running down her spine, something so deeply disturbing, so grotesque, she almost couldn't comprehend it. Karen was holding something in her hands. It was small, white, and grotesque in its simplicity, a corpse costume, meant for a child. Sarah's stomach lurched as Karen approached, her movements deliberate, as if she had rehearsed this moment 100 times before. "Karen, no. Stop!" Sarah screamed, her voice rising in desperation. "What are you doing? You're not taking her. You're not," but Karen ignored her, walking straight toward them. The sight of her was unbearable. She was smiling now, her lips stretching into something almost like a satisfied grin, as though she were performing a twisted, theatrical act. She was so calm, so unfazed by the carnage she had caused. And she was carrying Lily's corpse costume like it was the only thing that mattered. Sarah's breath came in short, ragged bursts. She felt as though the world was closing in around her, as if everything, her hopes, her dreams, the future she had imagined for her daughter, was slipping away, and in its place was this sickening nightmare. "Please," Sarah sobbed, holding Lily's unconscious form tightly against her chest. "Please don't do this." Karen didn't speak. Instead, she crouched down beside them, taking Lily's fragile body and, with terrifying precision, began to dress her in the corpse costume. The movement was clinical, almost methodical, as Karen pulled Lily's tiny, blood-soaked body into the disfigured garment. Sarah could barely process what was happening. The horror, the rage, the devastation, it all mixed together in a swirling maelstrom of disbelief. Mike tried to move toward Karen, but his legs buckled under the weight of the moment. He fell to his knees beside Sarah, his hands gripping the sides of her chair, his face pale with shock. He was lost, his eyes wide and unfocused as he looked at Karen's actions, unable to tear himself away from the nightmare that had overtaken their home. "What? What have you done?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. "Shoo," Karen said softly, as if trying to comfort them. "It's done. It's over. There's no going back now." Sarah felt as though the world around her was breaking apart. The words echoed in her mind, as if Karen were delivering the final blow to everything she had ever known. She had crossed a line. There was no coming back from this. No rationalizing it. Karen had taken something from them that could never be replaced. She had stolen Lily's innocence, her future, and with each slow, deliberate motion, she was taking something else: Sarah's sense of security, her belief that the world was still a place of order and safety. Karen had torn that apart with one unthinkable act. It wasn't just the shooting, it was the coldness, the cruelty. It was the way Karen had taken pleasure in their suffering, the way she seemed to revel in their grief as she dressed Lily in the corpse costume. There was no remorse in her actions. There was only a sense of satisfaction, as if she had completed a twisted mission. And the worst part was that Karen was still standing there, her eyes unblinking, watching as Sarah tried, in vain, to revive her daughter. "Please," Sarah whispered through her tears, "please let her go. She's not a puppet for your game. You've done enough. You've broken us." But Karen didn't care. There was nothing left for Sarah and Mike but the haunting image of their daughter, dressed like a lifeless doll, an empty shell of the little girl she had been. The Halloween night, once filled with promise and innocence, had become a grotesque mockery of everything they had ever known. Karen straightened, stepping back, her smile widening as she surveyed her handiwork. For her, it was a victory. For Sarah and Mike, it was the beginning of an unthinkable horror, a loss so profound it could never be understood, let alone healed. Lily, their precious daughter, was gone. And what was left was something far worse: the unrelenting cruelty of a woman who had found her way to destroy a family, piece by piece. The weeks that followed Lily's tragic death were a blur of pain, grief, and disbelief. The Halloween night that should have been filled with joy had turned into a nightmare from which Sarah and Mike could not wake. The images of that night haunted their every waking moment: the sound of the gunshot, the coldness in Karen's eyes, and, most of all, Lily's lifeless body dressed in that grotesque costume. But amidst the darkness, there was a singular, burning resolve: justice. They could not, would not, let Karen Whitmore get away with this. The system had failed them in those first few moments, the police had arrived late, the EMTs had struggled to stabilize Lily, and then the accusations. Karen had claimed it was an accident, that she was only defending herself, but Sarah knew the truth. Everyone knew the truth. Karen had acted with cold, deliberate malice, and it was time to make her pay. The first few days after Lily's death had been spent in shock, numbed by the overwhelming pain. But soon, as they began to piece together their lives, Sarah and Mike made a decision. They would not let this go. They would fight, for Lily, for justice, for everything their daughter had lost. The investigation begins. The investigation into the shooting moved slowly at first. Detective Jacobs, a seasoned officer with a kind but firm demeanor, was assigned to their case. He listened carefully to their statements, asked difficult questions, and assured them that they would get to the bottom of the tragedy. But the sense of justice they so desperately craved seemed to slip further away with each passing day. The initial reports came back inconclusive. Karen's gun had been legally registered, and her statement, that she had acted in self-defense after a confrontation, was taken seriously by the police. After all, there had been no witnesses, no clear video evidence, and the lack of motive made the case even more complicated. To the authorities, it seemed like an unfortunate but isolated incident, one that didn't warrant the intense investigation Sarah and Mike knew it deserved. But for Sarah and Mike, the idea that this had been an accident was impossible to accept. They were determined to find evidence that would prove Karen's guilt, her premeditation, her cruelty, and bring the full weight of the law down on her. "We can't let this slide," Sarah said one night, as she sat beside Mike in their dimly lit living room. "Lily's death can't be in vain. We need to find the truth, Mike." Mike nodded, his face pale and weary, but there was a fire in his eyes, one that matched Sarah's. "I know. We have to make sure she pays for what she did. No one else should have to go through this. Not like we did." They met with their lawyer, a woman named Emily Carlson, who had a reputation for taking on tough cases and never backing down. Emily was unwavering in her belief that they could win the case. But the legal system, like the police investigation, had its flaws. The trial was going to be lengthy, and the obstacles in their path seemed endless. They were determined to keep pushing forward, despite the hurdles. But with each delay, with each setback in the investigation, Sarah's frustration grew. It felt as though the wheels of justice were turning too slowly, and each day without accountability for Karen made it harder to breathe. A new discovery then, one cold afternoon, a breakthrough came from the most unexpected source. Detective Jacobs called Sarah and Mike into his office. The lines of weariness were evident on his face, but there was a glimmer of something else, a sense of urgency, of purpose. "I've got something," he said, leaning forward on his desk. "Something that might change everything." Mike and Sarah exchanged wary glances. They had been waiting for this moment for weeks, and every new lead had always fizzled out. But this time, Detective Jacobs's tone was different. "It turns out that Karen wasn't just a concerned neighbor," he began, his voice low. "She's been more involved with the HOA in ways we didn't initially realize. Her position as president gave her a lot of influence, but there's something else, something darker." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" "There's a financial aspect to this," Jacobs said. The HOA, under Karen's leadership, was engaged in some questionable financial dealings. There have been reports of funds being misappropriated, money being funneled into her personal accounts, and records being altered. There's even some evidence that suggests she was using her position to intimidate people, neighbors, homeowners, who threatened to expose her. Emily, who had been with Sarah and Mike throughout the process, leaned in closer. "Wait, you're saying that this isn't just about the shooting? There's more?" Jacobs nodded grimly. "Yes. I believe Karen's actions go beyond the incident with Lily. It's part of a larger pattern of manipulation and greed. She's been abusing her power as HOA president for years. The shooting might have been her final attempt to control and intimidate the Thompsons." The revelation hit them like a ton of bricks. They had always known Karen was ruthless, but this was a different level of corruption. Sarah's heart raced as she processed the implications. Karen's obsession with control, her need to punish those who didn't conform, now it all made sense. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was the realization that Karen might have been after far more than just a lesson for them. "Do you think she did this to protect herself?" Sarah whispered. "To keep the Thompsons quiet about what she was doing?" "It's hard to say," Jacobs replied. "But I wouldn't rule it out. She may have seen Lily and your family as a threat to her carefully constructed world. And the shooting, it might have been her way of sending a message to others who might cross her." Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. It wasn't just about Halloween anymore. It was about power, control, and a woman so deeply obsessed with maintaining her authority that she was willing to destroy everything in her path. The idea that Karen had shot Lily to silence them, to keep her secret safe, was more than they could bear. But this discovery changed everything. The financial misconduct, the years of intimidation, it was enough to open a full-scale investigation. There was now evidence not only of Karen's malice but of her corruption, of the way she had abused her position to enrich herself and maintain a stranglehold over the neighborhood. For Sarah and Mike, the discovery was a turning point. They weren't just fighting for justice for Lily anymore, they were fighting to expose Karen for the monster she truly was. The case was no longer just about the shooting. It was about taking down a woman who had caused so much harm to so many people. And for the first time in weeks, they felt a flicker of hope. The investigation would be long, the road ahead uncertain, but they were no longer passive victims. They were active participants in the fight for justice. And this time, they would not be silent. The courtroom was eerily silent as the gavel struck, signaling the end of yet another grueling day in what had become a lengthy, exhausting battle for justice. Sarah Thompson sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Beside her, Mike sat stoically, his jaw set, his eyes focused on the figure standing at the front of the room, the woman who had caused so much pain, so much destruction. Karen Whitmore. This was it. The final confrontation. Everything had led to this moment, and as much as Sarah wanted to scream, to lash out, to make Karen feel the weight of her actions, she knew the only thing that mattered now was the truth. Karen stood tall, her posture rigid, her eyes cold as they swept over the room. She had been unfazed throughout the trial, her expression a mask of indifference. But Sarah could see through it. Behind the stoic facade, Karen was a woman who had always been afraid of losing control, afraid of being exposed. That fear was the only thing that made sense of the cruelty that had driven her to shoot Lily, to manipulate her position as HOA president, to destroy a family in order to protect her secrets. The courtroom had been a battleground of evidence and arguments. Emily Carlson, their lawyer, had presented a damning case: Karen's financial misconduct, the years of intimidation, the gunshot that had left Lily lifeless in her own front yard. But it wasn't just the evidence that weighed on Karen, it was the way the Thompsons had fought. They hadn't just sought revenge, they had fought for something more important: accountability. They had fought for truth. For Lily. Sarah's mind wandered back to the moments after the shooting, when everything had seemed lost. When Karen had stood there, so calmly, so sure of herself, as if she were untouchable. But now, after all the pain, after the sleepless nights and the tireless effort to uncover the truth, Karen was finally facing the consequences of her actions. The prosecutor, a sharp and tenacious woman named Valerie Hayes, stood up and addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have seen the evidence. We have heard the testimonies. What happened on Halloween night was not an accident. It was a deliberate, calculated act of violence. Karen Whitmore took the life of an innocent child, Lily Thompson, and she did so without remorse. She used her position of power to manipulate, to control, and ultimately to destroy." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as Valerie's words echoed through the room. It had taken so long to get here. But now, in this final moment, the weight of it all settled on her shoulders. She glanced at Mike, his face grim, his eyes reflecting the same mixture of sorrow and determination that she felt. They had come so far, but the outcome was still uncertain. Valerie continued. "The defendant has shown no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of her actions. She has twisted the truth, using her influence to silence those who would speak against her. But we, the people, will not be silenced. We will not allow her to escape justice." Sarah's throat tightened as Valerie turned to the jury, her words like a rallying cry. "We ask that you deliver a verdict of guilty. Not just for Lily, but for every family that has been hurt by Karen Whitmore's cruelty. Justice is not just about punishment, it's about ensuring that no one else will ever have to suffer like this again." The room held its breath as the jury deliberated. Time seemed to stretch on, each second heavier than the last. Sarah felt as though she were trapped in a moment that would never end. The air was thick with tension, each person in the room waiting for the final judgment. Finally, the jury returned, and the foreperson stood to announce the verdict. "Guilty," she said, her voice clear and firm. A wave of emotion crashed over Sarah: relief, anger, sorrow, and a strange, hollow satisfaction. It was over. Karen had been found guilty, and justice had been served. But as the weight of the moment hit, Sarah realized that this verdict, this decision, would not bring Lily back. It would not undo the horror of that Halloween night. Karen's expression remained unchanged as the judge sentenced her, her eyes still cold and unfeeling. She had been stripped of her power, her influence, but there was no sign of remorse. No apology. No acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. And yet, for Sarah and Mike, there was something even more profound than the conviction. It was the feeling of reclaiming their voices. For so long, they had been victims, trapped in the shadow of Karen's control. But now, they had taken back their agency. They had fought for their daughter, for their family, and they had won. As the gavel struck, sealing Karen's fate, Sarah allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had been broken. Her heart had been shattered into 1,000 pieces the night Lily had been shot, and for months, she had been running on empty, clinging to the hope that justice would prevail. But now, there was a new kind of peace, one that came from knowing that they had done everything in their power to ensure that Karen would never harm anyone again. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. After the verdict, Sarah and Mike stood outside the courthouse, their faces tired but resolute. They had been through hell, but they had made it out. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, grieving for Lily, rebuilding their lives, the weight of their daughter's loss would never be gone, there was a flicker of light now. Justice had been done, and that was all they could ask for. Lily would have been proud, Mike said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She would have been. And with that, they walked away from the courthouse, their footsteps echoing in the quiet street, knowing that they had fought for the truth, and in doing so, they had taken the first step toward healing. But as they walked into the future, they knew that the fight for justice had left an indelible mark on their hearts. It had changed them. And they would never forget. It had been months since the trial ended, since Karen Whitmore's conviction had shattered the illusion of justice she had tried to build. The road to recovery had been long, filled with quiet moments of reflection and painful silences that seemed to stretch endlessly. For Sarah and Mike, Halloween, the night that had once been filled with excitement and joy for their daughter, had taken on an entirely different meaning. Lily was gone. Her laughter, her bright smile, her love for the holiday, all of it had been stolen in an instant. And though justice had been served, there was no amount of punishment that could bring her back. The house, once decorated with pumpkins and glowing lights, now stood empty, a hollow shell of memories that refused to fade. Sarah sat by the window, staring out at the street. The children were already starting to trick or treat, their excited voices filling the air. But to her, it was just noise, reminders of what they had lost. Mike had suggested they leave the house for the night, to try and escape the weight of the memories. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave. This was where everything had happened. This was where their world had been turned upside down. The world outside had moved on, but inside their home, it was as if time had stopped. Halloween, once a night of innocence, had been forever marked by the horror that had occurred on that fateful night. And now, it was a reminder of how fragile life was, of how everything they had known could be ripped away in an instant. "I miss her so much," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Mike, who sat quietly beside her. Mike placed a hand on her shoulder, his own grief evident in the sag of his posture. He, too, was haunted by the memories of that night, the sight of Lily, her blood staining the concrete, her body limp in his arms. But there was something else that gnawed at him. Something deeper. The guilt of not being able to protect her, of not being able to shield her from the cruelty that had come knocking on their doorstep. "We did everything we could," Mike said softly, his voice cracked with emotion. "We fought for her, Sarah. We fought for justice. And we won." Sarah nodded, but the hollow ache in her chest refused to subside. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about the emptiness that remained. The future without Lily. The years of birthdays, holidays, and milestones that would come and go without her. They both knew that they couldn't turn back time, that no verdict or sentence could ever fill the void that Lily had left. But Sarah also knew that their lives couldn't remain frozen in this grief. They had to move forward, not for themselves, but for the memory of their daughter. Lily had loved life with all her heart, and though her life had been tragically short, her spirit deserved to live on in the things they did next. "I can't imagine celebrating Halloween again," Sarah admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "How do we ever make it normal again?" Mike squeezed her shoulder. "We don't have to. But we can start small. We can still honor her. Maybe we keep the lights on this year. Let the kids come to the door. The thought of it was terrifying, but Sarah knew Mike was right. Lily wouldn't want them to hide away in the darkness. She would want them to live, to remember her with love, not sorrow. Slowly, Sarah turned her gaze toward the front door, the faint sound of children laughing filtering through the cracks in the walls. The house wasn't empty. It was full of memories. Full of the love they had shared, of the hope that had once filled their lives. The following days would be hard. There would be moments when the weight of Lily's absence would nearly crush them, when the silence would feel unbearable. But in the small acts of kindness, in the quiet moments of remembrance, they would begin to heal. They had no choice but to keep going, to rebuild. Not for Karen, not for anyone who had wronged them, but for Lily. For the little girl who had dreamed of a perfect Halloween. And so, as Halloween approached again, Sarah and Mike made a decision. They would decorate, but this time, it wouldn't be about the pumpkins or the ghosts. It would be about remembering Lily, the joy she had brought to their lives and the courage she had shown, even in the face of unimaginable odds. They wouldn't allow the fear, the loss, or the pain to define them. They would honor Lily's memory by living, by finding joy again in the small things, by creating new memories that would carry her with them always. As Sarah watched the children playing outside, their laughter now no longer so sharp and painful, she realized that perhaps the most powerful thing they could do in Lily's honor was to forgive. Not Karen. Not for what she had done, for that would never be forgiven. But for themselves. They had to forgive the world for its cruelty, forgive themselves for their inability to stop what happened. Halloween would never be the same. But in time, it would become a night of remembrance, not just of tragedy, but of life, the life they had once shared with their daughter, and the life they still had to live. Lily, Sarah whispered, closing her eyes. You'll always be with us. And we'll never forget you. In that moment, the house seemed a little less empty. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a flicker of something close to peace, a belief that, someday, they would find their way through the darkness. Together.